Okay, so this is lesson 5, still within the labour market failures of week 1 of Plan B. This is just a little starter, so pause this in a second and just have a think about what you think the answers to these questions might be. So which cities or areas of the country do you think have the highest unemployment? And the data I'm going to show you will be from about 2011 to 2015. Where do you think might be the lowest unemployment in the UK? Which occupations do you think have the lowest unemployment rate in the UK? And which occupations do you think have the highest unemployment rate? So pause, maybe find a just scrap bit of paper, write down a few answers of what you think they might be. Okay, so we'll have a little look at what these are. This is just a map of the UK showing highest and lowest areas of unemployment. So roughly speaking, the south east and a little bit of the southwest, around London, but also within London, have the lowest levels of unemployment. Then you have some significant levels of unemployment in the Midlands, Manchester, Liverpool, Nottingham, Wolverhampton. Some significant areas of unemployment in central West Scotland, Hartlepool in the northeast, and then an area of Wales there. So large cities, or many large cities outside of London, and Glasgow specifically within Scotland. In terms of occupations, so these are levels of unemployment. Again, this data is up to about 2015. So lowest level employment, judges, petroleum engineers, so those involved in the oil industry, surgeons, septic tank services, patrol officers, locomotive engineers, veterinarians, dentists, and nuclear engineers. So less than 2% unemployment for people that are skilled within those fields. In terms of highest unemployment, you've got plasterers, actors, rebar workers, iron workers, pavement equipment operators, boiler makers, up to nearly 30% within some of those industries. What a lot of them are to do with, or are all kind of linked to, are housing and construction. So from 2011 to 2015, periods after the global recession, significant amount of people skilled and utilised in construction before 2008 unable to get back into the workforce as construction not as significant. If you want to know what a rebar worker is, it's those people. So the people that put iron or steel bars into concrete, again in the construction industry. So significant amounts of unemployment in those sectors. And just in terms of what has changed, so this is during that period, so percentage changes of employment in those sectors, significant increases in science, support services, food, accommodation, health and social work, educational, transport, significant falls in construction, agriculture, manufacturing, public admin, defence, so some of that is to do with cuts to the public sector, and then a small amount in the motor vehicle sector. So over time, the structure of the economy changes, and there are different levels of employment within different professions and areas in the UK. Okay, so this lesson links to the information on page 26 around geographical immobility. So if you pause this for a minute or two, have a quick read of that section in the booklet, and then we'll start looking at the main topics. So this topic is linked to our labour market failures, and there is two specific types of labour immobility we look at. One is geographical and one is occupational. We want to look at what causes these, and also using some graphs to explain how they may lead to a market failure. So similar to the graphs we've already looked at, just supply and demands with social optimum added to analyse why the allocation of resources in markets may not be social optimum based on these immobilities. And again, just a reminder that there are a number of reasons why labour markets might fail to allocate resources effectively, and this is kind of the last one that we are going to look at this week before we come back to macro next week around the immobility of labour. You should have read down to about this section, and the questions that you've got in there link to immobility. I'm going to change some of those questions and give you a direction on what to take down. Within those sections, you're going to be taking down some graphs to explain geographical mobility, and then I'm going to change some of the information here to analyse it in a different way. So just to kind of give us a foundation, the definitions are pretty identical for geographical and occupational immobility. We're just going to use the definition for the supply of workers. So supply of workers who are unwilling or unable. The word move just links in with that in immobility. So they're unwilling or unable to move to a location where the demand for workers is high. So this is about a disequilibrium between the supply and demand of workers, and this is caused by those workers either being unwilling or unable to move. The reason I've kind of broke it up like this is the location part of the geographic plot. So moving to somewhere. In terms of occupational, almost identical definition, supply of workers are unwilling or unable to move to. In this situation, it's a different occupation where the demand for workers is high. So again, there is a disequilibrium between the supply and demand of workers in terms of where they are needed and the skills that the workers have to do those. And there is a link between occupational immobility and those skills gaps and skills shortages that we looked at in the last lesson. So reasons, why is there that mismatch geographically? Well, you'd have this chart in your notebooks, but this just goes to show that there is an average ratio of people's earnings to house prices of 5.1 in the UK. However, in London, that's 9.6, and if you are in Northern England, that's 3.4. So effectively, what we are saying is housing is very cheap in the northeast. However, housing is the most expensive in the southeast and specifically London. So what you have is a barrier, and that's the cost of living, to people moving to those areas. They may just see that as the higher rent wouldn't be something they could afford. Other reasons for geographical immobility. So we've mentioned that, the cost or access to accommodation. Take these down as notes. Cost of living in general. So kind of your basic wants and needs. A family or a social network. So sometimes people decide not to move because they have family who support with childcare, or because their friends, leisure activities are all in an area. It can be inertia. So sometimes people have done something the same way and they don't like to change that, or habitual behaviour. It could be the access or the cost of transport. So if you commute into Newcastle using the metro, it's going to be a lot lower cost than commuting with rail in London. If you are travelling a larger distance, maybe getting a season ticket from a village near London into London, that will be significant. For some people, they just don't have a car and the bus service doesn't operate to where they live, So if you are living somewhere in Northumberland, or you're living somewhere in the remote areas of Scotland, and you don't have a car, and you may be unable to get to work. In terms of occupational immobility, similar market failures around information gaps or inertia, so people not actually knowing what skills they need, or misinterpreting what skills they need, or becoming skilled for a job that doesn't exist. So that example from the skills gaps of forensic psychology. Again, inertia, so people just staying in a market where there is likely to be structural unemployment, so those jobs are going but not getting reskilled for another market. Globalization can lead to structural unemployment, so you can very rapidly be, your job can rapidly be moved to another low-cost location, and your skills are no longer required. It could be the cost or the access to education. So you may not get access to the best quality education because of where you live, or it might be that the cost of a degree is too high for you, in which case you wouldn't have the skills to move to a different occupation. It could be within an industry that businesses aren't investing in training, so that their own workforce isn't able to move to another job if they are laid off. It could just be the level of unskilled jobs within an economy. So from one point of view, if there is a high percentage of unskilled jobs, then people can occupationally move between those unskilled jobs. However, they wouldn't be able to move into skilled jobs. So if the percentage of skilled jobs is high and the percentage of unskilled jobs is low, then that would mean it would be quite difficult for people to move between those different occupations. And just the general level of skills in the economy, so numeracy, literacy, the foundations of primary and secondary education, if those are very strong and people, the vast majority, if not all people, leave school with GCSE English and maths, there is a basic level of skills that means that people can move between occupations. The last one on geographical mobility, which has just appeared there, is around the age of workers. So it tends to be that the older someone is, they may be more likely to be closer to retirement, less likely to move. It might be that they have a home which they've invested in for a long period that they want to stay in. It might also be that they have family around them, so age and those is a link into the family and social networks as well. Okay, so if we are looking at geographical immobility, and we think that there are jobs in London, so the employment here is less than the socio-optimum, then that would also indicate that there is upward pressure on wages, so wages will be greater than the socio-optimum. However, in Hartlepool, the employment, or more specifically the unemployment, would be greater than the socio-optimum, because there will be people without jobs, and this would also put downward pressure on wages, so wages would be less than the socio-optimum. So we're going to have to, this is what we're going to try and show with these two graphs, and it might mean being a little bit inventive to be able to show this. The most straightforward one is the market in London. So we'll have supply and demand, and we'll just have that the free market means that the quantity of employment and the current wage is too high, whereas the socio-optimum would be more people employed at a lower wage level. So this quantity between here could either be skills shortages within London. We'll make a quick assumption to make things simple, or simplify this Hartlepool graph. And what we're going to do is make demand perfectly inelastic, and you'll see why in a second. So what we're saying is that currently, whatever the level of employment is within Hartlepool, that is the socio-optimum. But currently the wages within Hartlepool are not socio-optimum. So the wage within the free market, and what you could say is that currently there is a level of people making themselves available in Hartlepool beyond that level of employment, which is causing unemployment. So that quantity in itself would be the misallocation of resources, but also the free market wage would be below the socio-optimum. So the reason we're keeping it inelastic demand in the short term is that this is all the businesses. We're just assuming that this is the fixed amount of demand that there are for jobs within Hartlepool. However, the wage being too low and the people not moving is creating a disequilibrium. So the solution would be to reduce the supply of workers in Hartlepool. This is the mobility of the workers, and then those workers would enter the London market and reduce the wage level within London to the socio-optimum equilibrium, and also take employment up to the socio-optimum. So both markets would achieve efficiency if the surplus of workers in Hartlepool moved to London. Okay, so taking Hartlepool again as the example, we've just looked at some causes for occupational mobility. Which do you think has been the most significant for the UK? And also think about why someone with the required skills to do a job, to be a teacher for example, who's willing and able to be a teacher, to find a job, and they are actively applying for teaching vacancies, still doesn't have a teaching job. Okay, so just pause it for a second, have a think about those two questions, make a couple of quick notes, and then we'll discuss them. So pause now. Okay. You could argue that for a significant amount of time that UK businesses haven't invested as much in training as they potentially could have, fearing that if they train up a member of staff that they'll leave. You could also argue that we are significantly impacted by globalisation, as being a country that hasn't really protected our industries, so people have faced significant amounts of structural unemployment and we haven't effectively helped them to reskill. On the second question, why might someone with the required skills to be a teacher, willing and able to find a job and actively looking for a job, still not have a teaching job? Well, one could just be a lack of teaching jobs. That would be straightforward. But also more nuanced, it could just be that they don't have experience. So even with all of the required skills, many jobs require some experience as well. Okay, so looking at an example of an exam question, explain why geographic immobility will likely lead to a labour market failure. Here's the structure for this question. So a definition for geographic immobility, explain some examples, so why it happens, what are the causes in the UK. You could use a supply and demand diagram to look at wage differentials regionally. So those graphs that we looked at, Hartlepool, wage too low, unemployment happening, London, wage too high, skill shortages. And then we could link this back to the question to clearly say why it's a market failure. So if you just want to pause, think about how you'd answer that question, and then we'll go through an answer in a second. Okay, so example answer, purple part is EO1, so your definition, geographic immobility is where workers are unwilling or unable to move to where the demand for workers is high due to high house prices. So this is our application. This causes regional wage differentials, such as pay being higher in London and lower in Hartlepool for the same occupation. So again, a little bit of application there. Excess supply forces the wage below the social optimum. So we've got a little bit of analysis there in the northeast, and excess demand above the social optimum in London, leading to misallocation of resources and market failure. Okay, so if you go back to your booklet on this next page, so I think that's page 27, there are some charts and these questions are linked to them. So again, just like you to pause in a second and have a look at the charts and make some notes on why you think these might be the case. So why have some countries in the EU found their workers are more mobile in leaving their countries? So the implication there is that newer members of the EU are more mobile. Why have some countries found EU workers taking up a larger percentage of their workforce? So why do these mobile workers tend to go for certain countries? Can you think of any reasons for the immigration patterns for the UK during the period shown? And why is the most mobile region in terms of workers globally the US? Okay, so pause it now, have a little look at those charts, see what you think, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so page 27, pause it now. Okay, so the first two charts are looking at patterns within the EU. So the outflow in percentage of labour force in countries, so significant in Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Bulgaria, Poland, Estonia, Slovakia, Portugal and Hungary. So most of these are Eastern European countries, with the exception of Portugal. And then an increase in the number of EU mobile workers after EU enlargement. So in terms of those new EU countries being more mobile than the original ones. So why have some countries in the EU found their workers are more mobile? Partly is that there were higher levels of unemployment within those EU countries, lower standards of living relatively. There was significant youth unemployment within those countries, and younger people being more mobile with less bills were able to move to other countries within Europe. Next two charts, why have some countries found EU workers taking up a larger percentage of their workforce? And can you think of any reasons for the immigration patterns in the UK during the period shown? So you can see that Luxembourg, Czechoslovakia, Ireland, Belgium and Austria all have significant, with Luxembourg I suppose the largest, but significantly larger influxes of workers from within the EU. The UK quite significant, and then going through to Germany and France being much lower as a percentage of the population. So this was data, or historic data. One of the reasons for a significant for the UK was a choice with some of those other countries for deregulation immediately. So when the EU expanded, we removed any barriers in terms of the single market. Many other countries, including Germany and France, chose to enact legislation that we could have chose, which was to delay or to restrict the numbers of people coming from new member states, I think for up to 7 or 8 years. Another draw factor was language. So the vast majority of people within the EU can speak English as a second language. However, I mean, Ireland significantly more so than the UK, but again, English being the main language of Ireland. Luxembourg, just for a separate reason, but similar to the UK in terms of during the period, a significant period of economic growth. So during the period up to the financial crisis, Ireland, the UK, Luxembourg all growing relatively quickly, incomes rising, and this being destinations where people could earn a higher wage than at home. Reasons for the immigration patterns in the UK. So you can see the emigration at the bottom there in terms of British nationals leaving over time, and little bits of people leaving from other areas, but most inbound immigrants staying. Most significant outside of the European Union, so over time up until around 2012-13, most immigration coming from outside the EU. Very small numbers from the original members of the EU over time, so that's the original members, France, Germany, Western European countries. Then you have the expansion of the first Eastern European countries in 2004, so then they significantly increased, but then after 2008 financial crisis becomes less significant. But at that point you've got Romania and Bulgaria joining, and then that starts to increase over time as well. So one of the big reasons for the patterns are the EU expansion, but then you also have some of the impacts of the financial crisis or the Great Recession of 2008. Last two ones are looking at mobility within America, so cross-border mobility within a country. So if you think about this as between the 50 states of America, between the 8 states of Australia, between the 10 provinces of Canada, between the old EU countries, so the Western European countries, and then the EU 27 at the end. And even though we've just looked at things that show mobility, America is the most mobile set of workers globally. And again, this other chart looks at the same kind of thing, that in terms of the US being the most significant. Things that make them mobile, one of them is this kind of a shared language, that effectively they have a single market. Anyone can work anywhere within the US. You also have culturally people studying at universities across America, and if you go to study at university you tend to stay in that region. You also have similar kinds of regulations around employment, and even though there may be slight differences in state taxes and so on, it's a pretty mobile economy. Okay, little recap then. So have a look at these 6 different situations. Would you say that they are geographic or occupational immobility? Just pause it for a second and see what you think for those 6. Okay, so the Geordie wants to stay geographically. You're occupationally immobile if you have upskilled yourself for a career that there's very few vacancies. High house prices in London, geographic. Good schools might keep you in a region because you want to stay there even though the jobs might not be available. Getting close towards retirement, you may not be willing to move to a new area, but also you may not be willing or able to take on new skills at that point in your career. And lack of transport would be a geographical immobility thing. Okay, so very quickly from today's lesson, again, just fill out your booklets, make some notes around the graphs, and just one quick question, have a try at, just one paragraph. Use the example answer we've already looked at for geographic immobility. Can you explain why occupational immobility will likely lead to a market failure as well?